Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my updated ranking of my top 5 favorite Star Trek book series. Now, I made one of these videos over a year and a half ago, and it was a very fun video to make, but I have had some changes, some rearranging, and I've read a lot more series. I have more experience reading now. I've now, since at the time that I made the video, I had only really read about 5 Star Trek series. And since then, my most recent count that I had was I have read about 14 different Star Trek series, at least either in their completion or I'm like near completion of finishing the series. So I've read a lot. And in fact, despite all the new ones that I've read, very few have actually jumped into my top 5. My top 5 is similar to what it was before, but there's been some minor changes that I want to talk about. Also, I have a much bigger audience now than I did with the original video, so I wanted to be able to have a bigger platform to talk about Star Trek books with people. So this is an updated ranking of my top 5. If I can do some quick honorable mentions, I thought that the Star Trek Legacies series trilogy that came out for the 50th anniversary of the original Star Trek series, that was a fantastic series. I also thought that the Mission Gamma books were quite a lot of fun. I also thought that the Star Trek Voyager Homecoming books, the duology Homecoming and The Farther Shore, both by Christie Golden, I thought those were excellent books and used to be on my top 5, but got knocked out by some little changes. So let's go over and talk about my top 5 Star Trek book series and why I like them so much. So the first ones I'm going to talk about is, this is kind of an unofficial series. So this series is not like a numbered books 1, 2, 3, 4 in the sense that the other books in this that I'll talk about are, but these 4 books I'll talk about form an arc, form a little series that I call the Full Circle series for Star Trek Voyager. They include the novels Full Circle, Unworthy, Children of the Storm, and The Eternal Tide. And these 4 books together tell what I believe is the full circle arc of the Voyager crew. It's about Voyager is now sent back into the Delta Quadrant. That's how it kind of begins, and it ends with a major character returning and with them making a new decision on how they're gonna move forward as the Full Circle fleet. In my opinion, this is the best Star Trek Voyager novel that is out currently. I think that Kirsten Beyer did a superb job with this series, but particularly with this book, because she reinvigorated the Voyager fandom. She said, we don't have to be back of the bus people in the Star Trek franchise. We can be the top dogs. So these books are really great. Particularly, I think Full Circle stands out, and the other real standout in this series is The Eternal Tide, which is this is like the season premiere. This is like a season finale. And these 2 books, and the other 2 books as well, are very good. I remember reading these 2 books back when. Back about I want to say it was 2019 or 2018. It was 2018. So it's been a while since I've had the opportunity to read these books. But I just had a blast when I read them. And what really worked with all of these books is that the characters are all nailed. Like the voices work really well, and these are fun stories to tell. They're not necessarily the most highbrow, and they're not necessarily the most exciting Star Trek stories, but when you nail the voices of the characters so much, then you don't have to have the most amazing story. As long as it's good, if you nail the characters, I'm pretty happy. And so they just nail the characters in these books. But particularly books 1 and 4, book 1, Full Circle, book 4, The Eternal Tide, those are all both amazing. So let's go to my number. And this used to be higher on my list, but it got lower because another book series came in and took its spot. Speaking of which, let's see what took its spot. My number 4 now is the Coda series that came out most recently. This is the most recent series on the list. This is actually the final Star Trek series in the post-Nemesis universe that, like, they had an interconnected universe that wrapped up. So the first book is Moments Asunder, the second book, The Ashes of Tomorrow, and the third book, Oblivion's Gate. And if you put the three books together, they form kind of what we call a triptych. So it's like one big cover. Wait, I did it wrong. Hang on. You put the three books together and you get a triptych. And I think it looks pretty good. I think they did a great job with the cover art. It's not necessarily the style of cover art that I like the most for Star Trek, but it works really well for this particular series because it conveys the chaos. It conveys how we're moving to the end and how everything is about to be destroyed. And so this trilogy came about because they realized they were doing new Star Trek stories in the Picard series, and they realized the Picard series was not going to follow the continuity of the post-Nemesis book universe. It was just expected. We know this. It happens with other franchises and book series. So they had two options. Three options. One option was to keep the post-Nemesis books going as is. The problem with doing that is that it won't have the impact anymore while it used to be what's carrying the Next Generation era, now the Next Generation era is carried by the TV shows, so it won't have the impact. So that option was not going to go. The second option was just to let it die and not do anything with it, kind of like what they did with the Star Wars Legends series. And while I didn't mind that happening, because I came into Star Wars, started reading Star Wars really after the Legends line ended, so I never felt that abruptness to the ending. So that didn't bother me then. It would have bothered me here because I was more invested in the Star Trek line because I was reading along starting about 2016, 2017. Then you have another element to this, which is the third option, which was to end it and make it tie into the Picard universe so that everything's hunky-dory, so that everything works out well. And that's the decision they decided to do with the Coda trilogy. I will give particular kudos to The Ashes of Tomorrow, which is just my favorite book in the trilogy. I think it was superbly written. I think that this book did in this trilogy what I wanted it to do. Book one was entertaining, but it didn't really go for the heights of what this trilogy should do. Book three wrapped it up. It was the true, like, David Mack, him being like, haha, I get to destroy the universe type thing. But there were so many decisions in this book that I was just like, I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't like that. I thought that so many of the decisions I would have handled a lot differently. And maybe you could say it's not bad because of that. It's just not, wasn't as entertaining. But man, was this book just near perfection. Everything about it was great. James Swallow just did a superb job with it, and it did everything I wanted it to do. So I was very happy with The Ashes of Tomorrow, which is a very good book. So that is the number 4 series on my list. It is a very bittersweet series. You will almost need a tissue because you're kind of sad it's all over, but that's why it's my number 4. Now, getting into my number 3, this one used to be lower, but over time it's actually raised in my estimation, and that is the Star Trek Destiny trilogy, featuring Gods of Night, featuring the Mere Mortals, and featuring Lost Souls. This is the big Borg event book that isn't entirely about the Borg. There's a Borg threat happening, and it's kind of an existential crisis where you know the Borg are coming, and there's a few sequences of the Borg destroying this, the Borg destroying that. But this series is really about connecting with this crew from the Enterprise era that has been lost. This crew is gone, and they're trying to figure out where they are and why they were lost. And so you have 2 timelines. You're reading about this crew back in the Enterprise timeline, and you're reading about the Next Gen timeline. And so you have all the DS9 characters, and you have the Next Generation characters, and the Titan characters. And Voyager has like they show up here a little bit, but Voyager doesn't really have too much to do in this series. It's more about Next Generation and Titan and DS9. And It's not the big war book that I think a lot of people expected. A lot of people expected something like Greater Than the Sum or Before Dishonor. And really, I love both of those books. And I still love this trilogy. But when I realized that it was more character-based and it was more about making a point about being anti-war, this trilogy really worked for me. So that's why it bumped up to the number 3 spot on my list. I think that David Mack did a tremendous job here, and this trilogy is the primary reason why he is like regarded as like the top Star Trek author for a lot of people, and he doesn't have that spot yet for me, but he's close. He's in my top. He has, as an individual author, is in my top 3, approaching my number 2 spot. Really, I would say he's tied with the person for number 2 favorite Star Trek author, just because this trilogy and some of his other books are that good. Speaking of which, let's go to just the epic series it's the biggest series I'll talk about in terms of page count and in terms of number of books present, but it is smaller in scope in that this is a little political story that's happening, and that is the Star Trek The Fall series, including Revelation and Dust, which really is about DS9. And then you have The Crimson Shadow, which has a little bit of the Enterprise and the Next Gen crew, but it's really a Garrick novel. Then you have A Ceremony of Losses, which is really a it's a DS9 overall, but it focuses on Julian Bashir and Ezri Dax and their characters. And then you have Book 4, The Poison Chalice, which is all a Titan novel. And then you have Book 5, Peaceable Kingdoms, which is a next-gen crew novel that kind of wraps everything up. And this is a series that is not cohesive in that it doesn't feel like a standard trilogy, or it doesn't feel like boom, 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 boom. For instance, when you read the Destiny trilogy, it reads book to the next, like part 1, part 2, part 3, and it's going along chronologically, or not necessarily chronologically, but you know what I mean, like it's going along. And same with like the Coda series or the Voyager series that I talked about. Instead, this series, it's like, let's follow these characters during this timeline. All right, let's follow these characters. Now we'll make references to the previous book, but the events of this book don't necessarily follow quite as closely. And then this book, it does follow the events of Revelation and Dust and has some references to the Crimson Shadow, but it's really more of its own type of book. And they each have certain specific political themes that they're dealing with. And I'll be honest, Book 1 is a mediocre book. Book 5 is a good book, but what makes this series thrive, absolutely thrive, is the middle books, 2, 3, and 4. These books, The Crimson Shadow, A Ceremony of Losses, and The Poison Chalice, are some of the best books in Star Trek. Some of the best books in Star Trek. The way that these authors tell political themes is unparalleled. In The Crimson Shadow, you have all of the Cardassia conflict that's happening and all of the political unrest. And Una McCormack in this book tries to portray Cardassia as a post World War II country, or even worse, a post World War I Germany. Post World War I, where everything's being dismantled, the people, the morals are in the gutter, and you can understand how good governments could form, or even how bad governments could form, because of the ringer that the people are put in. So the exploration, and then also you have the idea of Garrick, who starts considering politics again in this book. He's kind of been sitting out of politics, but he starts considering it again here, and I just loved the way that he's able to reclaim a leadership position, and he's able to step back in despite all the bad things that he's done in his life. So this Crimson Shadow novel was great. And then you have the best book of this bunch, and that's A Ceremony of Losses by David Mack. And I told you he's raised in my estimation. This book in particular raised him in my estimation. Oh boy, in this book, Julian Bashir became my favorite Star Trek character, and his morals and his determination to solve the Andorian crisis, and his determination to do the right thing even though his government is telling him no, that's the wrong thing. It is just superb, and you understand Bashir's side, but you also understand the government, and you are so frustrated. And I read this book, and I was viscerally angry. I was frustrated, and by the end of the book, I actually stood up and I took it. There was a walking path around my apartment at the time, and I just started walking on that path around the apartment because I was so frustrated at the characters in this book. I was so mad at them for not trusting Bashir. And when you can make me feel that way for your characters, you know you've done a good job. And then you have the Poison Chalice. Now, the Poison Chalice deals with the military themes of military officers being told to do things that they don't want to do. Also, it has to do with espionage and thriller-like elements of, oh no, there's someone bad somewhere in the government, and so Riker has to kind of be involved in rooting out who that is, and that's why he's promoted. And then also in this book, you have a theme about someone from the previous books is imprisoned, and now Riker has to go and break them out of prison because it's wrong that person's in prison. And it's just a great exploration of military political themes and also like thriller themes within the Star Trek universe. And it's also just so much fun. This is like a more action book, and it's just a fun book to read in addition. So this trilogy just nailed it. Not trilogy. This 5-book series, The Fall, nailed it. And book 5 wraps it up, and book 1 sets it up real well. Book 1's so sad. But this 5-book series is just gets into peak Star Trek. You just have to focus more on books 2, 3, and 4, not so much on 1 and 5. But peak Star Trek is in this series. But let's talk about the best Star Trek series, the best trilogy, the best single arc of books in Star Trek. I talk about it all the time, but that's because nobody else is talking about it, and it's just that good. And this is the Star Trek Prey series by John Jackson Miller. Hell's Heart, The Jackal's Trick, and Hall of Heroes. I apologize for how beaten up they are. I was in high school when I read these, and they've seen some better days. John Jackson Miller is my favorite Star Trek author. He is also my favorite media tie-in author because of his Star Wars books and because of his Halo stuff and because of his other things in Planet of the Apes and whatnot. He's a terrific author, a terrific tie-in author. No one understands the tie-in franchise better than John Jackson Miller. But this trilogy, I think, is his best work in Star Trek because you have all of the fun action that I feel like some of the original movies, like Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, and Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, it has the action that I love about those books. It also has some really quiet moments, like Search for Spock has. It also has some really great political themes throughout, like Star Trek VI does. It pulls from things I love about the Star Trek universe. And it's primarily a Next Generation series, but it includes some of the TOS. That's why the first book is really confusing to people because it has the Enterprise E and the Enterprise A both on it. That's because it pulls from all the it pulls from both of the eras, and I think that he did a great job of getting the voices of all the characters. He makes you really want to find out what's going to happen next. And he tells a big story, but he actually makes you feel the ramifications well. And also this is a Klingon trilogy, as you'd expect, based off of especially the third book. This is a Klingon trilogy where we understand the Klingons better. Both the good Klingons, the bad Klingons, everyone in between, people who are just trying to survive. There are some great spy stories in here. There's great action thriller stuff. There's some great character development for Worf, and there's some great character development for Kirk and Spock. And also, we get a little bit of Dax in the books. Curzon decks, I believe it is. And then we also get some good Riker stuff in Book 2. Book 2 has some great Riker stuff. So this trilogy, it's the one I love the most. I read it originally in 2017, and then I went back in 2021 and reread it, and I loved it just as much. Like, sometimes rereads make me dislike a book because like it doesn't hold up. This was a trilogy that held up, and so now we're in 2023, and I'm like, man, summertime, I want to reread this trilogy because I think it would just be a blast because I love it. So that's my ranking of my favorite Star Trek book series. I couldn't get all of them in here because I've read like 13 or 14, and yeah, I love so many. But this was just a terrific series that I'm talking about here. So if you've read these series, do you agree with my placement? Do you think I'm crazy for some of the placement? I know most people don't have John Jackson Miller at their top, but I do. Are you a big David Mack fan, or should I go back old school, be looking more into the Peter David books or the Alan Dean Foster books? Like, let me know your thoughts on the Star Trek mythos and the literary series down below. And please subscribe to the channel where I have a ton of book reviews and book news and book things related to Star Trek. So, until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.